That night, he counted the coins 3 times. Not because he couldn't add, but because, deep down, he was hoping the number would change. As if maybe, just maybe, he had miscounted the first 2 times. As if reality might be kinder on the 3rd try. The sound of metal hitting the kitchen table was louder than the silence of the house. 3 reais and a few small coins. That was all that stood between him and the end of the month. He stared at them arranged on the worn wood like they were evidence of something. Evidence of every wrong turn, every missed chance, every moment he had believed things would be different by now. Outside, the street was alive. Cars passing, people laughing, lights glowing in apartment windows where life seemed to happen with a kind of ease he couldn't quite imagine. Inside that cramped little room, time felt frozen. Like the world outside was moving at full speed and he was stuck behind glass, watching. He was 32 years old. And he carried a constant, bone-deep feeling of being behind. The empty wallet didn't just weigh on his finances. It weighed on his chest. It pressed there at 2 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. It sat beside him at the table when he ate alone. Because it wasn't just about money. It was about looking in the mirror and not recognizing the man he had promised to become. It was about remembering every time he told someone things were going to work out. Remembering the faces of people who believed him. And the faces of the ones who smiled a little too knowingly when he said it. That night, sitting on the cold floor with his back against the wall, he thought something he had never admitted out loud. He thought that maybe success simply wasn't meant for someone like him. That maybe some people are born into the current and others spend their whole lives swimming against it. That maybe he was one of the swimmers. And it was exactly there, in that quiet surrender, that something shifted. He had grown up being told to be realistic. And in his world, realistic meant take any job that would have you. Realistic meant accept less than you wanted and be grateful you got that much. Realistic meant never let yourself dream so big that the fall would break you. So he didn't dream big. He took the warehouse job. Then the door-to-door sales route. Then the delivery runs that started before sunrise and ended long after dark. He came home exhausted in ways that sleep couldn't fix. And still, the money was never enough. There were months when he had to choose between bills. Weeks when he pretended to himself that he wasn't hungry because pretending was easier than admitting the truth. The rejections came steadily and without apology. Resumes sent into silence. Interviews that ended warmly and then disappeared. He tried building something small with the money he had managed to scrape together. It collapsed. He tried again. Lost more than he started with. He was told he lacked the right background, the right education, the right presence. He was told he was too much of a dreamer for the world he lived in. And every failure arrived like a confirmation of something the world had been trying to tell him for years. That he wasn't built for more than this. The worst part was never the falling. It was standing back up and not knowing why. Standing back up into the same uncertainty, the same doubt, the same mornings that asked him to believe again in something he couldn't quite see. The real battle wasn't happening out in the world. It was happening inside him, every single day. Every morning he woke up and negotiated with himself. Just one more attempt. Just one more application. Just one more day of showing up. But by night the doubt would return, louder and more convincing than before. He watched people he had grown up alongside building lives that looked nothing like his. Vacation photos, new cars, homes with space in them. And there he was, counting coins on a kitchen table, wondering what they knew that he didn't. The comparison became something toxic. He started avoiding gatherings where he'd have to explain himself. Stopped sharing his plans because sharing them made the failure more public. The fear he carried wasn't simply the fear of failing. It was something deeper and more specific. It was the fear of trying with everything he had, and discovering that everything he had still wasn't enough. There was one night in particular when he sat in the dark without turning on the light. Not because the electricity was out. Because the darkness felt honest. He thought about giving up. Not in a dramatic way. Just in the slow, quiet way of someone who has decided to stop reaching. Find a steady job. Keep his head down. Stop imagining anything different. It would be easier. Less painful. Less exposed. But something kept nagging at him beneath the exhaustion and the fear. A question he couldn't quite silence. What if he never found out how far he could go? What if he settled right at the edge of the life that was actually possible for him, and never knew it? He realized something important that night. He was already in pain trying. So he might as well be in pain trying the right way. And he understood, maybe for the first time, that he didn't need to feel motivated. He didn't need to feel ready. He needed to make a decision and let the feelings catch up later. The turning point didn't arrive with a windfall or a lucky break. It arrived with silence, a different kind of silence than the kind that had been haunting him. After one more rejection, he stopped announcing himself. No posts about new beginnings. No promises made publicly. No trying to convince people who had already made up their minds about him. He just went quiet and got to work. He started waking up an hour earlier. While the city was still dark and still, he sat at the table with an old notebook and whatever coffee he could stretch. He studied. Not textbooks or formal courses, at least not yet. He studied his own situation. Where the money was going. What was actually happening versus what he was telling himself was happening. He tracked every single cent, and for the first time he could see, clearly, that his problem wasn't only income. It was direction. He had been moving without aim for years and calling it effort. He cut things that once felt harmless. Small indulgences that were really just ways of bribing himself through the frustration. It hurt to let them go, because they were the little moments that made hard days bearable. But he started to see them for what they were. Comfort borrowed from a future he was supposed to be building. He decided to stop borrowing and start building. He approached his work differently. He had spent years trying to convince people. Now he tried to understand them. He listened more carefully, watched what went unsaid. He paid attention to why people hesitated, and realized that most of the time it wasn't about the product or the service. It was about trust. People didn't say no to what he was offering. They said no to the uncertainty they felt in him. So he worked on that. He practiced how he carried himself, how he spoke, how he entered a room. Not to become a performance of confidence, but to stop automatically making himself smaller than he was. He took jobs that his pride would have once rejected. Small work, simple projects, modest money. But he had shifted the way he thought about them. Every client was a chance to build reputation. Every mistake was tuition. Every delivered promise was a brick in. Something that would eventually hold weight. The months that followed were genuinely hard. While people around him rested and enjoyed their weekends, he was reviewing numbers and watching instructional videos with a notebook open beside him. There were nights when his head ached and his body asked him to stop. And the doubts still visited. Sitting in the middle of a late-night study session, he would sometimes wonder if this was all an elaborate way of avoiding the truth. If he was going to end up exactly where he started, only older and more tired. But something had changed in the foundation of how he thought about himself. He wasn't performing effort for an audience anymore. He was building something real, quietly, in private. And that distinction mattered more than he expected. He started saving money. Not large amounts. Sometimes embarrassingly small amounts. But he saved consistently, and the habit itself was the point. The first month he closed with anything left over, even barely anything, he didn't celebrate. He just sat with the feeling. Breathed it in. Because it was new. Because it had never happened before. He began paying closer attention to people he admired, not with envy but with genuine curiosity. What was different about how they operated? He started noticing that the people who had built real, lasting things in their lives weren't the loudest or the flashiest. They were the most consistent. They did the work when no one was watching, and they did it the same way every time. That was the thing he had been missing. Not talent. Not luck. Repetition. He set small goals. Achievable ones. Not the enormous vague ambitions that had always paralyzed him, but specific, close targets he could actually reach. And when he reached them, he set new ones. The cycle became something he trusted. There was a moment that crystallized how much had changed. A client tried to negotiate his price down the way clients sometimes do when they sense you need the work more than they need you. In the past, he would have folded immediately. This time he held his number. His heart was going fast and he wasn't certain he was doing the right thing. He lost that client. He walked away from the conversation questioning himself. But underneath the uncertainty was something he hadn't felt in a long time. A kind of self-respect that didn't depend on someone else handing it to him. 3 days later a different client came, paid the full amount without discussion, and thanked him for the quality of the work. It was a small thing. But it was proof that positioning yourself correctly is not arrogance. It's accuracy. The results that came after that weren't dramatic. They were quiet. One bill paid ahead of schedule. A small reserve that stayed in a separate account, untouched, growing slowly. One satisfied client who mentioned his name to someone else. That someone else became a client. That client mentioned him to another. No explosion. No viral moment. Just a slow, steady accumulation of trust and consistency. There was a month when it nearly unraveled. A major contract canceled without warning. A family health expense that arrived at exactly the wrong time. 2 clients who went silent on payments. The reserve he had built with such careful effort began to shrink. The old fear came back with full force. His mind offered him all the familiar exits. Accept any work at any rate. Make impulsive decisions. Panic visibly. Convince yourself it was always going to end this way. But this time he had something he had never had before during a crisis. He had a record. He opened his notebook and looked back at where he had been. He saw the numbers from those early months. The goals that once seemed enormous. The problems he had solved. The skills he had built. And he understood that this difficult moment wasn't the end of the story. It was part of it. He breathed, analyzed clearly, renegotiated where he could, and found new clients through strategy instead of desperation. It was uncomfortable, but it wasn't chaotic, and he learned that the real measure of how far he had come wasn't the absence of difficulty. It was how he moved through it. Years passed like this, slowly, then all at once. The income stabilized, not in a way that made headlines, but in a way that changed how he woke up in the morning. He could plan further ahead. He could help someone in his family without calculating the cost to himself. He could say no to work that wasn't right without his chest seizing up with fear. He sat back down at the same table one evening. The wood still had the same marks. The same scratch in the corner, the same old coffee stain. Nothing about the table was extraordinary. But the man sitting at it was completely different. On the table in front of him there was no scattered change. There was a notebook, a phone, a cup of coffee he could drink without mentally converting it into a percentage of his monthly budget. The silence in the room was the same silence that had once felt like a threat. Now it felt like something he had earned. He had become someone who could sit quietly in his own life without flinching. He hadn't become a celebrity. He hadn't accumulated some impossible fortune. He hadn't been discovered or rescued or handed anything. What he had built was something quieter and more durable than any of that. He had built consistency. He had built a character that difficulty had made stronger instead of smaller. He had built self-trust, and that was the thing that changed everything, because every other form of success had followed from that one thing. He thought about the man on the cold floor, counting coins for the 3rd time, hoping the number would change. He wished he could tell that man something. Not that it would be easy. Not that help was coming. But that the decision to keep going, made quietly and without any guarantee, was going to be the most important decision of his life. That the version of himself sitting calmly at this table years later was built entirely from that choice. That the noise of other people's progress would eventually go quiet, and what would remain was the question of what he chose to do when no one was watching. The coffee had gone cold by the time he finished his thoughts. He closed the notebook, stood up slowly, and turned off the light. Some victories don't announce themselves. They don't arrive with applause or recognition or any of the signals we were taught to look for. Sometimes the only proof that you made it is a quiet room, a settled chest, and the simple, profound freedom of not being afraid of your own life anymore.